欢迎收看美国之音的焦点对话节目，我是樊东宁。美国总统拜登上任100天以来，他的外交政策和美中关系一直是外界观察的重点之一。其中，台海情势和新疆的种族灭绝，在过去这3个月来也成为了国际社会关注的焦点。我们今天很高兴为您邀请到前美国国务院主管经济、能源与环境事务的国务次卿克拉奇 ，Mr. Keith Krach。来到美国之音的演播室参加我们的节目讨论，相信各位对克拉奇并不陌生。他在去年9月份时曾经代表特朗普政府拜访台湾，成为40多年来访台级别最高的美国国务院现任官员。但大家或许不知道的是，克拉奇不但是美国的资深外交官，也是纵横商场名扬硅谷的一位 CEO。他曾经担任 Ariba DocuSign 的首席执行官，也是通用汽车最年轻的副总裁。Mr. Krach, welcome to Voice of America.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Daphne. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Mr. Krach, you are a Silicon Valley veteran and now a former State Department official. What was your private sector experience like, especially with China, and why did you decide to serve in government?
Well, my first experience in China was back in 1981 when I first went over there right when I joined General Motors. And, I'm a lover of Chinese history and the Chinese culture. I've been going there for many years, obviously on business. But the last trip I took before I went into government, when I was running DocuSign, it was a listening trip because we were deciding whether we want to enter the country of China. But at that particular time, I could see things had changed, and I could see how aggressive General Secretary Xi was, and that's what really gave me some concern. And I really didn't know anybody in Washington except one high-level official who I had worked with before, and I wanted to see if they really understood what was going on, and they obviously did. And then they asked me, they said, have you ever thought about serving your country? And I said, that's a dream I never knew I had. I'd be honored. They said, can you move? I can move anywhere in the world. So it's been a great privilege. And my mission was to develop and operationalize a global economic security strategy that would maximize global economic security and national security for countries everywhere, and to drive economic growth, as well as to combat China's economic aggression.
And also, when you traveled to Germany last year, you went viral on social media when you said, I quote here, Mr. Xi, tear down China's great firewall. Why did you say that in Berlin, and what was your overall China strategy when you were undersecretary at State Department?
Right. Well, I was right at the Berlin Wall. And it really reminded me, and I drew the analogy between how the Berlin Wall separated the German people, just as China's great one-way firewall separates the Chinese people from the truth. And that's when I asked General Secretary Xi to tear down that firewall, because all the data comes in, but none goes out. And all the propaganda goes out, but the truth does not come in. And so if you look at my strategy at the State Department, and I said this in my Senate confirmation meeting, it's really to harness 3 of the United States' biggest competitive advantages. That is, strengthen our relationship with our allies and our friends, leverage the innovation and resources of the private sector, and amplify the moral high ground of democratic values.
Okay, and you were also the highest ranking State Department official who visited Taiwan since 1979. Could you please share with us more detail of that important trip from your perspective?
Yeah, it obviously was a great honor, and it really fit in with our overall strategy. The purpose of my trip was to go to President Lee's memorial service, right? We would call him the George Washington of Taiwan. I was greeted with 40 fighters and bombers, but it really gave me a chance to interact with a lot of the business people that I've interacted with before over the years from the private sector, but also spent a lot of time with the government. And I had a great dinner with President Tsai. And it was really there that we came up with it was a catalyst for our economic prosperity partnership between Taiwan and the United States.
You said that you interacted with the businessmen there in Taiwan. That we know that you also helped foster strong economic ties between U.S. and Taiwan, especially including a $12 billion deal with Taiwan semiconductor manufacturing company TSMC. That's a big deal.
It was the biggest onshoring in U.S. history. And TSMC is perhaps the most important global company to the United States national security. And it was a great experience. We actually accomplished that in 2 weeks. And they also brought their ecosystem. And I really think this really helped strengthen the ties between the United States and Taiwan. And it's so important because Taiwan in the region is a role model for democracy and capitalism. Actually, they are for the entire world.
You also mentioned that the PLA sent nearly 20 fighter jets and bombers when you were there. What was your reaction to that?
My reaction was, why are you doing that? I mean, I think that, they wanted to show some force. I was going over there to honor a great person. I think it's classic
李登辉
of the Chinese Communist Party.
Okay, and then we know that the tensions across the Taiwan Strait actually have risen considerably over recent months. We hear a lot of people in Washington, D.C. talking about what could happen if China tried to invade Taiwan. How worried are you that China will have a war with U.S. over Taiwan?
Yeah, well, I think that's a possibility. And, that was a big purpose of forming that economic prosperity partnership. And then a month later, we signed a science and technology agreement, which usually takes a year to get done in the United States government, and really laid the groundwork in terms of more trade and investment from the United States. And that also draws investment into Taiwan from other nations, from our allies. And I think that's really important when it comes to defending Taiwan.
Okay. And you also recently co-wrote an op-ed in Newsweek in which you said the moral imperative to end the Xinjiang genocide is one of the most unifying and bipartisan issue of our time. You're also calling for American business to help stop the genocide in Xinjiang. So could you please share with your thoughts on how they can help and why taking actions on this issue is so important to you?
Well, first of all, it's punishable genocide. These are some of the worst crimes to humanity that are going on in the world. So to call that out, I think, is very important. And I think it exemplifies General Secretary Xi's 3C's doctrine of concealment, co-option, and coercion. Now it's grown into genocide. And what I called on for people around the world is to join together and to do something about that. I wrote a letter to all United States CEOs about this, in terms of making sure their supply chains are clean without the slave labor from Xinjiang. I also wrote one to all the university governing boards. I wrote to all the civil societies. But I think at the end of the day, for the American citizen, the way to really speak the loudest is to ring the cash register over there in China, because there are so many companies that enable, Chinese companies that enable the surveillance state and the atrocities in Xinjiang. And so the whole point is to divest of these companies, don't invest in these companies.
Mr. Krach, do you think U.S. should boycott Beijing's Winter Olympics over China's Xinjiang atrocities?
Well, with the genocide going on over there, I think it's hypocritical for the International Olympic Committee to say, hey, let's hold these great humanitarian Olympic Games over there. I think they've got a big decision to make.
You're a successful businessman, but for the businesses around the world, sometimes, standing up to China's human rights abuses is easier said than done. like the Xinjiang column is one example. So you were chairman and CEO of tech companies, including Ariba and DocuSign. I believe that you are very well aware of those difficult decisions companies have to make between profits and ethics when doing business with China. What would you say to those leaders of multinational companies who constantly have to make those difficult decisions?
Yeah, well, I think it's a question of your principles or profit. And the way I was raised and where I come from, your integrity is everything at the end of the day. And if you don't have that, you have absolutely nothing. And so, yes, you do have to make those decisions. And as a CEO or a chairman of the board, you get paid to make those tough decisions. And they also have a moral responsibility and a fiduciary duty to make sure that whoever they do business with is upstanding, and particularly when you're talking about an issue as big as genocide.
Right. One of the most common metaphor of U.S. and China relations is that we're running a marathon, but who is the winner at the last? So let's talk about U.S. and China are engaging in a very fierce competition over the technological supremacy. As a prominent leader in the tech industry, how do you view this competition, and what kind of action should U.S. take right now to ensure it's not on the losing side of this U.S.-China tech war?
Yeah, well, I think really three fundamental aspects to it. The first one is to turbocharge our own economic competitiveness. The second is to safeguard our assets, our strategic assets, our technology, which there's been so much intellectual property theft through the years. The third one is to form an alliance of democracies, companies, civil society that operate by a set of trust principles for all areas of economic collaboration. Because if you think of what the CCP has done, they've used those trust principles like integrity, transparency, reciprocity, respect for rule of law, respect for the planet, respect for property of all kinds to their economic advantage. So what we did with the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies is we actually used it against them. And we said, if you don't abide by those trust principles, we're not going to do business with you.
And Mr. Krach, your team at the State Department also developed a 5G clean network that turned the tide against Huawei. How important is that 5G clean network? Can you explain?
Well, I think that's really important because it defeated China Inc.'s master plan to own 5G communications. And 5G communications is just not your phone. This is about utility grids. This is about Internet of Things, manufacturing processes, all kinds of sanitation systems. So this is a really important thing. But what it really was is it also showed that China Inc. was beatable, and it exposed their biggest weakness, which was lack of trust. But the other two objectives was to create a model for competing with China Inc., as well as to provide a beachhead for many other areas of economic collaboration, whether it's clean infrastructure with clean financing, clean energy, other areas of technology.
And also earlier this year, you and the former Secretary of State, Mr. Pompeo, and also 26 others were labeled as anti-China politician. And you were on number 3 on the list, to be sanctioned by China, which means that you and your immediate family member are prohibited from entering China. And companies and institutions associated with you are also restricted from doing business with China. What is your response to China's sanction on you, your business, and your family?
Well, I got sanctioned because I did my job and I got results. It's inconsequential to me and my family. It really doesn't matter. Maybe it's a medal of honor, but why should I react when I can act? And I am not going to bend a knee to General Secretary Xi, and I don't think anybody else should as well.
U.S.-China relationship is complicated. It's like love-hate and also cooperation at the same time with competition. what should U.S. do about it right now? Because now it is at the lowest point in decades. And what's your hope for the future of this relationship?
Yeah, well, I always remain hopeful, for sure. But I also think that that General Secretary Xi has really amped up the aggression. And even though they say, hey, a win-win relationship, it's not. It's a zero-sum game. Mm-hmm. And I think the world has woken up to the truth about his 3C's doctrine of concealment, co-option, and coercion. And the world now understands that the pandemic is a result of the concealment of the virus. Mm-hmm. I mean, they shut everything down. People lost their lives, all kinds of things like that. And I think people can see the co-option in Hong Kong has resulted in evisceration of its citizens' freedoms. Mm-hmm. And now the coercion in Xinjiang has grown to genocide, and the world doesn't like it. It's the most unifying bipartisan issue of our time. And I think, if you look at that, the 800-pound elephant in the room is the CCP's retaliation and intimidation. And this is why the Clean Network was so successful, because it represents a security blanket. There's strength in numbers, and there's power in unity and solidarity. And I think the world's woken up now.
Mr. Krach, if you could send a message to Xi Jinping, what would it be?
I guess I would say the world does not trust you. And you sanctioned me. It has no effect on me. But it sends a message to the Biden administration, sends a message to business leaders all over the world that you're not to be trusted. And there's consequences for that.
Ms. Krach, thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Daphne.
好的，非常感谢前美国国务次卿克拉奇来到美国之音的演播室参与我们的节目讨论。那么来宾发表的是个人观点，不代表美国之音。